Okay, can you see it okay?
Yeah, that looks good.
Good, we got there. Okay.
Perfect timing, Jan.
Nothing like it.
Keeping it real.
Just as everyone arrives at the same time. Perfect timing.
Excellent.
Thank you everyone for coming to this session. We're delighted to have you here. I won't introduce the panelists. They'll introduce themselves as they start their presentation. We've only got a very small amount of time and we've got 3 presentations to get through. We would also like to leave time for questions at the end as well. If you could put your questions to the panel on the live Q&A box on the conference portal rather than using the chat function in Zoom. It would just be easier for me as the chair to moderate questions through the online conference portal rather than through Zoom. So that would be great. Thank you. I think we're ready now to turn to the main body of the breakout, which is the 3 presentations looking at different ways in which we can think of assessment in relationship to a post-COVID world. I think we'll start with Jan. Are you happy to go first?
Yes. Sure. Okay, here I go. Okay, so can you all see that okay?
Yes, thank you, Jan. That's perfect.
Great. Okay, so thank you everyone for the chance to come today. Some of you may have read the blog that I wrote leading up to this event, which probably sounded quite pessimistic about the fact that things probably won't change post-COVID, and if they do, they'll get worse. There's a reason for that pessimism, that my work is very much grounded in early critical theory, which I refer to as having a radical pessimism. And the reason for this is to try and avoid feel-good terms, you know, like be it social justice or authentic, things that make us feel good, but actually don't convey much meaning and don't lead to meaningful change. So I hope today to try and temper that pessimism just a little bit, but not entirely. So as I said, my work is based in critical theory, and this is a good description of what that means. What is just is that which allows the individual member of our society to realise his or her own life objectives in cooperation with others and with the greatest possible autonomy. So basically it's about the fact that individual and social well-being are intertwined, and there cannot be justice for me if there isn't justice for you. So when this horrible thing came along, many people thought, you know, actually that's where the world's heading. We've started to see that. We've started to see that we rely on one another for our own individual as well as our social well-being. And it was backed up with these sorts of lovely images in the first lockdown of people helping out, sending care packages, pamper packages to the NHS workers. But by the second lockdown, this was the sort of heading that we were having in the newspapers. COVID workers getting abuse. People were tired, people were cranky. People wanted to go back to the golden age of the so-called normal. And that's what I fear might happen in the realm of assessment if we're not careful. I also want to say that we have to be very careful about talking about what we may have gained through COVID when so many have lost their lives, their health or livelihood. But what I think we can do is reflect back on certain things and then look forward to where we might take them. So in terms of assessment, I think what happened during COVID is that academics did have some sense of solidarity. We had to work together as the only way to get through the challenges we were faced. People began to talk openly about pedagogy. Now I know QAA types talk about it all the time, but your average academic often had got out of the habit of talking about it, and they had to when they were faced with this weird online world. It also provided a clear demonstration of the role of a university and its graduates in society. You know, what we do matters. It can save lives. It hopefully gave a better understanding of the stresses students faced because we saw it in this incredibly extreme condition. Did it lead to assessment flexibility? Well, I'm really pleased to hear in some places it did, and that's terrific. But in a lot of places, it actually led to people just trying their damnedest to find an online equivalent for the traditional exam and not changing anything any more than they had to. And the obsession with proctoring software and so forth, rather than rethinking the fundamentals of why we're assessing. Did it help people understand the stress academics face when they mark? I'm not sure. I think everyone was too stressed to notice any more stress. And the problem of marking stress and marking overload is something that we're going to have to address if we ever want to improve the way we assess. And did it lead to an end to, oh, we've always done it this way? Well, some places, yes, but some places, no, if they're desperate just to go back to what they used to do. So we've got some challenges as we think back on what may have changed. And when I come to authentic assessment, a traditional, I think the first place to think is what would inauthentic assessment look like? If authentic assessment is this brave new world, what on earth have we been doing all these years? What were we doing if we assessed, if it wasn't authentic? And the claim of authentic assessment is that it's about real world tasks. And that's fair enough, but there are some problems with that as well. So firstly, the real world is often taken to be the world of work. Now, work is important to well-being, but it's not sufficient. The real world is often presented as external to students. You have to prepare for the world out there, as if they're not already part of it. The real world is something we cannot change. It exists separate to us, and we have to just do its bidding, what it tells us to do, rather than that's something that we and our students can shape. The real world is what employers want, but actually we know as universities that employers are not always that clear what they do want from us, nor are we always that clear what we have to offer them. And of course, the worst is assessment becoming something that develops simply a compliant workforce. So my view of authentic assessment takes the focus from the task to the student. What would be an authentic thing for a student to do in terms of them as a social human being? The task is still important, but now that it's in the context of the student. So I'm doing this because knowing how to do this will help me contribute to society. The students matter from this framing. They bring things to an assessment task and they're empowered with a sense of what they bring and what they have to offer. Their sense of achievement matters. It matters to themselves, it matters to others. So this achievement is intrinsic as well as extrinsic. From a critical theory perspective, they have to understand, they have to recognize themselves as having worth as well as being recognized by others. The world of work matters, but it is not enough. And assessment now becomes something that helps students achieve recognition of their social membership, because through their university learning, they're developing skills, traits, dispositions with which they make a contribution to society. And just to end, I want to share a few quotes from a large project I'm part of, which is a longitudinal and comparative study of chemistry and chemical engineering students. So here's a fairly typical first year quote. It was quite rewarding, given that it felt more real, like what the actual lecturers do. Obviously, when they do their research, they do this all the time. I was just like, yes, I feel like I'm doing real science. Now, in all of these quotes, the students don't necessarily mention assessment, but these are quotes from the parts of the interviews where we're having a discussion about assessment. But you see, this seems to me to ring of authenticity about doing real science, but he's not saying he's actually working as a scientist. It's not about the job. It's about the identity of being a scientist. And I think that's valuable. But what was sad is that these sorts of comments were there in first year and they gradually disappeared over the years of the students' undergraduate degrees. But then this is a bit more hopeful in a way. The assignments are also more, I feel like, to get us to know about what's happening outside of our studies and what's actually happening in the real world. So with chemical engineering, for example, this year we've been focusing a lot on water because of the water crisis. So this was a South African student, severe water crisis. And so the assignments were geared to address a real world problem. So that's a good example of authentic assessment in many ways, except what is worrying is that out of all the interviews we had with the cohort of students on this program, only some of them made these connections. So it wasn't completely successful. Something else was missing. That's what we found. Then this lovely quote from first year: if I want to go into research and if I want to change the world, if I want to change a problem in South Africa, I will have to study and get my degree and go further on. And this young woman's interview is full of quotes about changing the world. It's delightful. But compare it to this: I want to be able to walk out as a chemistry student that companies would like to hire. Now, that's authentic, isn't it? Because it's about getting a job in the real world. But it's not the same as the previous quote. But what if I tell you they're the same person? The first quote is them in first year. The second quote is them at the end of their degree. And it just seems to me something's been lost. And I think it's something important, and I think it's something that we should include in our idea of authentic assessment. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. Some really fascinating ideas there for us to consider during the course of this breakout. And again, we'll take questions at the end after everybody's done their presentation. So I'd like to hand over now to Vicky for her presentation.
Thanks. Let me just get it up. Okay, can you see that okay?
We can, Vicky, but we can see your notes, so you may need to switch the swap displays at the top of the.
How's that?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, great, good. Okay, so hi. Thanks so much for the invitation to come and to talk about the Collaborative Enhancement Project and to respond to this theme of authentic assessment in a post-COVID world. So my name is Vicky Hill, and I'm an educational developer in the Academic Enhancement team at University of the Arts London. And I've been working there for about 4 years, supporting students and staff to develop inclusive practices and pedagogies. And my background is in arts education, and I've taught and managed across all different sectors: secondary, further education, and higher education in the UK and Turkey and in Vietnam as well. So I'm going to be talking to you a wee bit about the Collaborative Enhancement Project that I'm leading. We've just started 13 days ago, so not even 2 weeks ago. But I'd like to give you a little bit of background as to what's kind of been informing this work. So at UAL, I co-lead with my colleague Liz Bunting the Fostering Belonging and Compassionate Pedagogy strand of work. And it's a staff development enhancement work. It's one of 3 themes that was launched in August 2020. And we're bringing together the course teams to collaboratively kind of problem solve ways to address ethnicity awarding differentials between home white students and home students of colour. As you can see, we have fostering belonging and compassionate pedagogy, enhancing assessment for equity, and then decolonising pedagogy and curriculum. And more we've been talking about how we can bring and merge different aspects of these. We've really designed this work to create spaces for staff to be able to really talk about their teaching interactions, both staff to student and student to student, in relation to bias, racism, oppression, within an arts higher education context. The work, when we launched it, it came at a really critical time in higher education. Obviously, the UK had entered into our first COVID lockdown, and the Black Lives Matter movement globally amplified the calls for racial justice in the wake of George Floyd's murder. So our work was really about creating spaces for staff to be able to respond to these shifting contexts. And we really recognize that, belonging will always matter, but at these times, and particularly at times when we're feeling so much more disconnected, it becomes even more important. So, so the team, the work we were doing at UAL, we came together with some different colleagues. None of us have worked together before, strangely, although we've met each other, I think, in different contexts. But we came together from 3 very different institutions. We have UAL, which is a very large arts institution made up of 6 colleges. We have Glasgow School of Art, and then also Leeds Arts University. But what we found in our discussions as we thought about putting the bid in for this project, we were all committed to social justice, and we were really interested in bringing belonging and compassion into our higher education environments. And we were super interested in the ideas of equitable assessment and what that looks like, particularly within a creative arts context. So just to give you a little bit of sort of background really around our thinking on our project, it's called Belonging Through Assessment, Pipelines of Compassion. And we were really understanding this phenomena of belonging as something that's effective and transitory. It can be lost and found through the student's journey. And we define it as students' feelings of being valued and respected and supported, included, feelings of mattering by teachers and peers so that they can feel part of their community. We draw on the research that demonstrates the significance of belonging as a psychosocial identity factor, and also how it contributes to the inequitable experiences of global majority students. We draw on Mountford and Zinder's really great report on the causes of differential outcomes for some of our thinking. We see belonging as effective, as unstable, but it can be contested and negotiated. And in moments of vulnerability, it can take on a real heightened importance and really can be at greater risk. So we're sort of thinking that, as educators and within our institutions, we have this agency to influence this and to show students that they matter. And we've been thinking about how we can kind of foster this within our teaching, their assessment practices, and we're really interested in compassion as a value and compassionate pedagogies as an approach. So compassionate pedagogy encourages educators to foster belonging by creating those conditions that recognize structural oppression and attempt to reduce their impact on students. I really like Paul Gilbert's definition. There are many, but I really like Paul Gilbert's definition of this, about noticing of distress and or disadvantage to yourself or to others, and this kind of commitment to take action to reduce it. There's something really interesting here that echoes what Jan said about recognizing staff and students together in this journey need to be acknowledged to create a socially just context. And I really see this compassion as different to empathy or kindness, in that there is a real call to action. It's about doing something. So kind of how does this relate to our assessment? Well, as we've been thinking about this work, we've been thinking more about needing to understand belonging through intersectional lenses. And as our institutions have come together and we've spoken with each other, you really want to include a kind of wide range of different groups' experiences and understand the data to disaggregate this further too. We recognise that belonging has been significantly disrupted by COVID, and our assessment policies and practices have moved into asynchronous and synchronous and digital spaces. But we've also responded, particularly at UAL, to the temporary, using temporary no detriment policies to alleviate some of these really difficult situations that students have been in. So the evidence regarding kind of issues of attainment have shown that there's a prevalence of unbelonging, and we recognise that COVID has really exacerbated this. But we're really interested in how the kind of our institutional policies have responded to it, and that kind of also brings the role of belonging into arts assessment practices and puts it back into the social justice spotlight. And I put Jan's quote up here about really kind of seeing assessment as a really important space, and we're thinking around authentic assessment and how this relates to belonging and compassion. If we're committed to social justice, assessment is absolutely key to the achievement of that. So we're seeing assessment as relational, and we're aware that there hasn't been a lot of dialogue, activity, of work going on about how assessment can really be approached to be thinking about belonging through meaningful and compassionate interactions and practices. And that's where we're really interested in exploring this further, particularly in a creative arts context. We want to know what each stage of assessment, how our students experience feelings of belonging, and we see that as really critical to their experience and identification of successful learners in higher education. So as we've been discussing and developing our work, we're aware that we want to understand the importance of belonging and compassion in assessment policies, and creating a space through this project to challenge some of those normative assumptions that regarding what counts as valued interactions and contributions. And we want to think further about the role that assessment policies and practices as pipelines play in reascribing social inequalities through the student journey, into higher education through that, but also into the teaching profession afterwards. And we would like to look at proposing new quality indicators of assessment that really are surrounding belonging and compassion and equity, to see what we can do and explore there. Okay, so our conversations clearly have moved from from sort of teaching and pedagogy to really thinking about kind of structure and agency, and how we can think about belonging within our whole institution. And we've been becoming increasingly interested in how compassion as a core value can influence policy design, implementation, and enactment, particularly all of those that are related to our assessment, and thinking around what that means. As I said at the beginning, our project started a whole 13 days ago, so we're obviously in super early stages, and we're just building that to work collaboratively with staff and students at our 3 institutions. So there's a project blog which has just gone up, so you're welcome to have a wee look at that, and hopefully it will be documenting our journey and the research and the events and things that we're doing as we go through. We have a launch event booked for the 10th of June, and we're hoping that this is we'll be leading it with Glasgow School of Art and Leeds and UL together, but we're wanting these events to be collaborative and participatory in the space where we can explore some of these kind of wicked problems and paradoxes that exist when we try to kind of develop humanizing and compassionate relational approaches to assessment within our cultures. And then we will also be having a symposium a bit later on in October, again, drawing different voices in from the sector. So the idea is that this will all bring together in our kind of research information that we can then start to think about how we're going to develop a digital resource for the sector. This is kind of, I've put on here a link to one of the podcasts that we've created at UAL on our work around belonging. And we've been really interested in how we can use sort of creative arts methods, ideas of listening, participatory ways of creating kind of educational development work, which really builds on the ideas of polyvocal dialogue, critical pedagogy, and a space where sort of dialogic relationships and constructing ideas can happen. So the digital resource that we would look to build would very much be drawing on those learnings, and also the kind of the creative experience that we have from our partner institutions. So that's kind of summing it up, really. That's again the link to the blog. I'd be really interested if anyone has questions at the end or points for us to be thinking about. That would be fantastic. And obviously got some references, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Vicky. That's great. Would it be useful for you to cut and paste a couple of those blog links into the chat so people can access them directly in the session?
Sure. Do you want them in the Zoom chat or the other one?
If you just put them in the Zoom chat for now, that would probably be fine.
Okay.
Thank you, Vicky. Okay, I'm going to hand over now to William, who's going to, again, follow the theme of the breakout around assessment and the way we need to think about it post-pandemic. So over to you, William.
Thanks, Andy. So hi everyone, good morning. My name's William Hastie. I work in education enhancement at the University of Strathclyde. So firstly, thank you to QAA for inviting me to contribute to this session. I want to use my time to share some thoughts I've had around how we are actually going to make changes towards more authentic assessment stick post-pandemic. So picking up on some of the themes that Jan introduced us to at the start of this session. And I'm interested in how we're going to foster and further these enhancements through very practical actions we can take. So I do share, as you'll see, some of Jan's pessimism about this, but I also have tried to think about the ways in which myself as a kind of educational and academic developer can help the process in even minor ways, and that's where my presentation ends today. So what I'm presenting today is based on research with students in 8 departments of Strathclyde around their experiences of assessment over the past year and over the course of their degree programmes prior to the pandemic, and also a wide range of initiatives to support staff in adopting and adapting new assessment formats over the course of the past 14 months. So my aim is to make a case for paying attention to the relatively low-key activities in academic development and quality assurance as a means of making changes that we've seen stick. One too many. So a wee bit of context and some assertions from me. So as we know, the pandemic forced teaching staff to rapidly adapt and reinvent assessment profiles in almost all modules and programmes. I know of only a few programmes at my own institution where assessments didn't change very much, and that was usually because they didn't feature traditional exams. And picking up again some of Jan's comments about the nature of the change, my focus today is predominantly on traditional exams and what happened with those. So arguably the biggest and most widespread change in assessment has been the sudden and almost complete decline of traditional, tightly timed and invigilated on-campus exams, and the immediate flourishing of what we used to call take-home or open book exams in their place. As far as I can see, the reading of this across the sector, most notably in the sector leading writing of Kay Sambell and Sally Brown on this matter, is that this is a welcome and long overdue embracing of more authentic assessment methods. Changes in format, such as allowing access to notes and other resources, and in focus, with questions moving from recall and retrieval to more problem solving and higher order skills thinking type questions, are what are said to make these open book exams more authentic, which is to say more like what a student is likely to face in their life and work after their studies. Brown and Sambell and many others besides have called for this shift to be celebrated and seized upon, and it's common to hear talk of never going back to the way things were. And this seems to be what students are expecting too. Here are a couple of extracts from focus groups I've recently held with fourth-year students studying at Strathclyde. What strikes me when I speak to students about assessment is how sophisticated their understanding of it usually is. So far from grumbling and complaining, their comments are so often about assessment design and about the relationship between their assessments and their learning and their sense of themselves. The tester process and the literature which has been developed around this has been a wonderful tool for foregrounding this over the years. One of the students I spoke to talked about how the assessment regime in their programme prior to the pandemic had been regurgitative. The physical gestures they were making while they made this point were really interesting, though possibly not the best to dwell on these just so close to lunch as we are now. They talked about how their old exam format had not really helped them to learn, how it had been unduly stressful, and how it hadn't helped them to prepare for their profession. They went on to say, when is your employer going to sit you down in a room and ask you to answer a question on your own with no access to any resources that would help you? A fair question, I would say, and one which speaks to an understanding of what authentic assessment means in that particular student's context in a professional, vocationally focused degree programme. Another student made it clearer still. They felt like their old exam format focused on their ability to memorise for the short term, not on their ability to develop knowledge and skills. They said, ideally, I would want to spend the time learning and apply that to a question, but I actually spend the time writing down case names in different colours so I can memorise them, so I can write them down in the exam, but I can't remember any of them afterwards. I wasn't really learning them, I was just cramming them. And I think that's a situation lots of students are familiar with. I certainly remember doing that for exams too. The whole group that I was speaking to as part of this particular focus group felt that the open book exams that they were now sitting were a better test of their skills and more like what they would be doing in their profession. So in their view, more authentic. And this is what the sector has gained, notwithstanding Jan's timely and right caution about talking about gains and obviously not suggesting that these gains have been seen everywhere. But certainly in my own institution with lots of our big degree programs, these have been potentially gains that we've seen. More authentic assessments, potentially we're seeing on a massive scale. And I think it'd be interesting to discuss whether there's ever been a bigger shift a bigger progressive shift in assessment practices in such a short space of time. Interesting to hear Jan's views on that earlier. But like Jan, I do have concerns about whether or not these gains are going to stick where they have been made. There are, to my mind, a number of kind of latent threats to whatever progress has been made. So, like the lecture that we had this debate at the start of the conference, the traditional exam is often forecast to die, but will it this time? Most of the concerns that I hear about this are a combination of two or more of the following points. So firstly, exams are quite familiar and convenient to most of our colleagues, and we can't overestimate the influence of this. Secondly, internally and externally, there are a whole range of assumptions about how secure and trustworthy traditional exams are compared with any alternative. And our QA, our quality assurance arrangements, and the relationships we have with industry and PSRBs and society at large were formed in different times. What influence will these arrangements and relationships have in re-establishing the traditional exam post-pandemic if they remain unchanged? For most of us, large classes are a fact of higher education life. And like the lecture, again, going back to what we had at the start of the conference, there are questions about the scalability of alternatives to exams, particularly around the admin, marking and feedback burden that those potentially could bring. There's also a danger that some will reach out for tech solutions to what are assessment design problems. So as Jan mentioned already, we've seen lots of our colleagues reach for tech solutions such as remote proctoring as a means of retaining the traditional exam format in distance learning contexts. Will this tendency remain as we progress out into the post-pandemic HE environment? So in sum, we shouldn't be assuming that any gains we've made towards greater authenticity in summative assessments such as end module assessments are actually really secure. We should be thinking about ways in which we can secure those going forward. So the answer to this problem, if it indeed is a problem, will vary from context to context, but it's hard to see how maintaining and enhancing any gains that we've made cannot depend to some extent on maintaining and enhancing our staff. My thoughts on this have developed over the past year and have been shaped by my involvement in a number of staff development and support initiatives, from running assessment-focused drop-in sessions right through to co-developing and co-teaching a new module on assessment for our postgraduate certificate in higher education. My feeling now is that the most significant impact on whether or not we can retain and build on the gains made during the pandemic will depend on a series of minor or kind of low-key development and quality assurance initiatives. These are not exciting things like developing a new module for a PG Cert, but they are, in my experience, what really busy colleagues need and what will help to ensure that post-pandemic assessment continues to become more authentic. So here are some principles that I've been working with during the past 14 months, or developing over the past 14 months around this issue. The starting point for me is always to assume that my teaching colleagues are really busy. And I honestly can't overstate how crucial this has been to my design process whenever I've been trying to put something in place to work with colleagues. I've also found that finding spaces where you can gently influence is so important. For example, we ran informal adapting assessment drop-in sessions throughout the year and found these invaluable for reaching a wide range of teaching staff who want to know more about assessment, but often in a really specific way. They wouldn't have the time, or in some cases the inclination, to sign up to a PG Cert module, or even the more formal CPD sessions on assessment that we were running. But they did have questions and they did have worries. And with the right level of support, they were able to find alternative assessments, nearly always more authentic, because we were able to steer the conversation in that direction. This kind of kind, sympathetic and expert and informal guidance will be just as important as staff transition into a more blended or straightforwardly back on campus teaching environment. Similarly, I found that building low-key mechanisms for sharing information and ideas can be really useful in reaching staff who can't or won't commit to formal CPD in this area. So for example, I produced an annotated bibliography of alternative assessment literature and resources for a university working group, and used that mechanism to ensure that these ideas and resources were distributed throughout the university via more local working groups and committees. And numerous staff followed up after that to tell me how useful they found that summary of research and ideas that they wouldn't have been able to find time to engage with otherwise. Finally, we need to think about our QA, our quality assurance. This is going to be really important. And it's not just the content of the QA, it's also how we present this and engage colleagues with it. I found that reorientating guidance to be more reflective can really help colleagues. So, for example, I recently rewrote some guidance on feedback to large classes, and a challenge in itself, which leads many to attempting to retain the traditional exam for reasons that we just went over, to be more reflective and to include prompts around assessment design, and which hopefully lead staff to better choices around assessment and potentially more authentic assessment in the future. Also, the very content of our policies and regulations are really important at this juncture. Although emergency changes will have been made and pushed through over the past year at most institutions, the vast majority of our quality assurance documentation was drafted for another age. Reviewing it to make sure it's fit for purpose and fit for what we want to do next, including fostering more authentic assessment profiles across our programs, is going to be crucial. So, like I said, none of this is particularly exciting, but it is really important. I have an example that I wanted to run through, but I'm actually going to leave it there to make sure we've got time for questions. So I'll call a halt to this here. Thank you for your attention.